There was a time when Linda Evans seemed to represent everything glamorous about television. She had elegance, warmth, and a screen presence that made audiences feel as if they were watching someone almost larger than life. To millions of viewers, she was not just another actress. She was a symbol of beauty, poise, and old Hollywood softness in an era that was becoming louder, faster, and more ruthless. But what happened to Linda Evans after the spotlight began to dim? For many people, her name immediately brings back memories of Dynasty, the hit primetime soap that helped define the 1980s. In that series, Evans became unforgettable as Crystal Carrington, the graceful counterpart to a world of power, wealth, betrayal, and emotional warfare. The show became a television phenomenon, and by the 1984-85 season, Dynasty had climbed to the top of U.S. ratings. Evans also earned major recognition for the role, including a Golden Globe and multiple People's Choice Awards. Yet the Linda Evans story did not begin with Dynasty. Long before she became one of television's most recognized faces, she was a shy girl named Linda Evanstad, born in Hartford, Connecticut, and raised in Hollywood after her family moved there when she was still an infant. Her parents were professional dancers, and one of the surprising details about her early life is that acting first entered the picture not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but because she was shy. Drama classes reportedly helped her come out of her shell. That quiet beginning makes her later fame feel even more remarkable. Her rise started in television during the 1960s, and she gained major recognition playing Audra Barkley in The Big Valley, the Western series that ran from 1965 to 1969. That role made her a familiar face in American homes and showed that she had more than beauty. She had steadiness on screen, the kind of presence that made people keep watching. Years later, many fans would still remember her from that role just as fondly as from Dynasty. Still, it was Dynasty that changed everything. When she stepped into the role of Crystal Carrington in 1981, Linda Evans became something more than a television actress. She became an icon. Opposite John Forsythe and later Joan Collins, she helped turn the show into a cultural event. The fur coats, the diamonds, the private jets, the legendary confrontations. Dynasty sold the fantasy. But Crystal, played by Evans, brought a softer center to all that excess. She gave audiences someone human to hold on to in a world built on spectacle. That is part of why her fame felt so powerful. Linda Evans was glamorous, yes, but she also seemed approachable. She was polished without looking cold. Even at the height of her success, there was something vulnerable in the way she carried herself on screen. And maybe that is why so many people feel emotional when they look at her life now. Because time changes everyone. The fame, the magazine covers, the award shows, the applause. None of it freezes a person in place. And Linda Evans, like so many stars of classic television, eventually stepped away from the machine that had once made her so visible. She left Dynasty in 1989 before the series ended, later returned for Dynasty: The Reunion in 1991, and then moved more and more toward a quieter life, largely stepping back from screen acting by the late 1990s. To some fans, that disappearance felt mysterious. One day she was everywhere. Then, slowly, she was not. But disappearing from Hollywood is not always a tragedy. Sometimes it is survival. Linda Evans has spoken over the years in ways that suggest she valued peace far more than endless visibility. Her official biography emphasizes her early life, career, and personal evolution, while later public appearances and interviews have shown a woman reflecting on the past rather than chasing it. Even in more recent public posts, the tone is less about celebrity and more about gratitude, memory, and life experience. That may be the part some people find hardest to accept when looking at stars from another era. The realization that the woman they remember in jewels and perfect lighting is also a real human being who aged, endured heartbreak, and had to rebuild herself outside the fantasy that made her famous. And yes, there was heartbreak in Linda Evans's life. Her personal life included highly publicized relationships, including her marriage to John Derek, which ended painfully, and later her long relationship with musician Johnny. Those chapters made tabloid headlines, but headlines rarely tell the emotional truth of what a person carries. Behind the image of a perfectly composed television legend was a woman who lived through public disappointment and private reinvention. That is what makes her story more than just nostalgia. It is not simply, where is Linda Evans now? It is, what does it mean when someone who once seemed untouchable becomes human again in the eyes of the world? At 83, Linda Evans represents something deeper than faded fame. She represents endurance. She represents a generation of stars who gave everything to the screen, and then had to figure out who they were when the cameras moved on. And for fans who grew up watching her, that realization can hit hard. Not because she is forgotten, but because seeing her now reminds them that time has passed for everyone. The face may be older, the energy may be quieter, the life may be more private, but the impact she made on television history is still there. And maybe that is the real reason people feel emotional when they see Linda Evans today. They are not just looking at an actress. They are looking at a memory, a piece of another era. A woman who once stood at the center of one of television's most glamorous worlds, and then chose, in many ways, to walk away from it. That kind of story is never just sad. It is tender, it is human, and it is impossible not to feel something when you realize that even legends grow older, become quieter, and leave behind not just performances, but echoes. What made Linda Evans so unforgettable was not just that she became famous. It was that she seemed to carry grace through everything, even when life gave her reasons to fall apart. By the time Dynasty turned her into one of the most recognizable women on television, the public saw glamour, confidence, and beauty. What they did not always see was the emotional cost of becoming a symbol. Linda Evans was admired by millions for playing Crystal Carrington from 1981 to 1989. After first becoming widely known as Audra Barkley on The Big Valley from 1965 to 1969. Those two roles alone placed her firmly in television history. But behind the polished image was a woman whose personal life had already been marked by deep disappointment. One of the most painful chapters in Linda Evans's life was her marriage to actor and director John Derek. They began dating in the mid-1960s and married in 1968. For a while, it must have seemed like the kind of Hollywood romance people dream about. But the marriage ended in heartbreak after Derek left her, later becoming involved with the much younger Bo Derek. That public betrayal became one of the defining emotional wounds in Linda Evans's story. Not just because the marriage failed, but because it failed so publicly. And that is something many people forget about classic stars. When ordinary people suffer heartbreak, they grieve in private. When famous women suffer heartbreak, the whole world turns it into a headline. Linda Evans kept going. That may be one of the most remarkable things about her life. She did not let personal pain erase her future. She rebuilt. She worked. She kept moving forward. She even married again, though that second marriage, to Stan Herman, also ended in divorce. Later relationships came and went, including a long relationship with musician Johnny that lasted through much of the 1990s. Again and again, her life seemed to reflect a pattern many people know well but rarely associate with glamorous stars: searching for lasting love and not always finding it. By the late 1980s, another major turning point arrived. Linda Evans left Dynasty in 1989, before the show fully ended. After that, she stepped further and further away from the world that had made her famous. She returned briefly for Dynasty: The Reunion in 1991, but her career no longer moved at the same speed. Instead of chasing non-stop screen work, she shifted her energy elsewhere. Reports about her later career note that she semi-retired from acting, focused on fitness projects, wrote a beauty and exercise book earlier in her fame years, and made only occasional appearances before eventually stepping away from screen acting for a long period after 1997. To fans, that slow disappearance felt haunting. How does someone go from being one of the brightest faces on television to living largely outside the spotlight? The answer is probably more human than dramatic. Not everyone wants to remain trapped inside the version of themselves that fame created. Linda Evans's public image was so tied to glamour that people almost expected her to live forever under soft lighting, forever elegant, forever untouchable. But real life does not preserve anyone that way. Time moves, fame fades, priorities change, and sometimes the person behind the legend simply wants peace more than applause. Years later, Evans spoke about returning to the screen for the film Swan Song, released in 2021, her first screen acting role in decades. In an interview with People, she said she had faced health issues before making that return and admitted she was nervous about acting again. That detail mattered because it showed something powerful. Even after all the fame, all the success, all the years in the business, she was still human enough to feel fragile. And maybe that is why seeing Linda Evans at 83 affects people so deeply. It is not because she failed. It is not because she vanished. It is because she changed. The world remembers Crystal Carrington in silk gowns, perfect hair, and elegant stillness. But Linda Evans today stands for something more meaningful than eternal beauty. She stands for survival. She stands for reinvention. She stands for what happens after the cameras stop and a woman has to decide who she is without them. That is a much harder role than any television part. She also endured the quiet sadness that comes with outliving an era. Many of the people, shows, and moments that defined her rise belong to another chapter in entertainment history now. Even her bond with John Forsythe, whom she first worked with when she was very young and later reunited with on Dynasty, became part of that passing world. Accounts of her later life note that she remained close to him and was devastated by his death in 2010. So when people look at Linda Evans now, they are not only seeing an actress grow older, they are seeing the passage of time itself. They are seeing what becomes of a woman once adored by millions, once photographed as if she belonged to fantasy, once treated as the embodiment of television elegance. And the truth is both beautiful and painful. She is no longer the untouched icon people remember, but something even more real. An 83-year-old woman who lived through fame, heartbreak, reinvention, distance, and return. A woman who kept her dignity even when life changed the script. A woman whose story still moves people, not because it is perfect, but because it is not. And that is what makes Linda Evans impossible to forget. There is something uniquely emotional about watching a star like Linda Evans grow older in public memory. Not because aging is tragic, but because certain faces become tied to a time in our lives that we believed would never end. For many fans, Linda Evans was not simply an actress from a hit television series. She was part of an era when glamour still felt magical, when television families seemed larger than life, and when stars looked like they belonged to another world. Seeing her now at 83 forces people to confront something deeper than nostalgia. It forces them to confront change. And change can be painful. For years, Linda Evans seemed to live in a kind of golden light. On Dynasty, she represented softness in a ruthless world. She was beauty without cruelty, elegance without arrogance, and strength without noise. That image stayed with people. It stayed so strongly, in fact, that many could not separate the woman from the role. But life after fame is rarely as polished as the image fame leaves behind. After stepping away from the center of Hollywood, Linda Evans began to live more privately. That choice may have looked mysterious from the outside, but in many ways it was deeply understandable. Imagine spending years in front of cameras, under constant judgment, with every wrinkle, every romance, every career move turned into public property. Sooner or later, a person begins to crave silence. And Linda Evans seemed to choose that silence. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of self-preservation. That may be one of the saddest things for longtime admirers to accept. The world wanted her to remain a symbol forever, but she was no symbol. She was a woman. A woman who had already been through public heartbreak, professional pressure, and the exhausting weight of being seen as flawless. At some point, stepping back may have been the healthiest thing she could do. Still, privacy has its own melancholy. When a beloved star disappears from regular view, fans start to wonder. Is she okay? Is she lonely? Does she miss the life she once had? Does she ever look back and ache for the years when the whole world knew her name? Those questions are part of what makes Linda Evans's story so emotional. People do not just miss her performances. They miss what she represented. And when they see her now, living far from the frenzy that once defined her, it can feel like watching the last page of a beautiful chapter turn quietly. No scandal, no grand finale, just time doing what time always does. And yet, there is dignity in that. Linda Evans did not spend her later years desperately trying to recreate the past. She did not turn herself into a caricature of her former image. She did something far more difficult. She allowed herself to become a real person again. That may not sound dramatic, but for someone who was once treated like a fantasy, becoming real again is one of the bravest things imaginable. Because reality is unforgiving. Reality means the applause fades. Reality means beauty changes. Reality means the people who once stood beside you are no longer always there. Reality means memories begin to outnumber plans. That is why her story touches such a deep nerve in those who remember her. Linda Evans reminds people that fame is not the ending of a life story. It is only a chapter. And sometimes, the chapters that come after fame are quieter, lonelier, and far more honest. At 83, she no longer needs to prove anything. She does not need to reclaim a crown. She does not need to compete with the young stars of another generation. She does not need to stand in the center of attention to matter. Her legacy is already secure. But legacy does not erase emotion. In fact, sometimes it deepens it. Because when people look back on Linda Evans, they are not just remembering a career. They are remembering who they were when they watched her. They remember evenings in front of the television. They remember the glamour of a world that felt impossibly far away. They remember admiring a woman who seemed calm and radiant, even in chaos. And then they look at her now. Older, quieter, softer, more human than ever. That contrast is what makes people emotional. It is not that she has become less. It is that she has become real in a way that icons rarely do. The illusion is gone, but the woman remains. And sometimes the woman left behind is more moving than the fantasy ever was. Maybe that is the hidden truth in Linda Evans's story. The tears people feel are not only about her. They are about themselves, their youth, their memories, their vanished decades, the people they used to watch with who may no longer be here. Linda Evans becomes a mirror for all of that. She is a reminder that nothing glamorous stays untouched forever. Not fame, not beauty, not television history, not even the brightest stars. But there is still something beautiful in what remains. A life lived, a name remembered, a face once adored that still carries grace even after time has done its work. And maybe that is why seeing Linda Evans at 83 feels so powerful. Because she is no longer just Crystal Carrington. She is no longer just a star from Dynasty. She is a woman who lived long enough to outlast the illusion. And there is something heartbreakingly beautiful about that. What makes Linda Evans's story so difficult to forget is that it does not feel like the fall of a celebrity. It feels like the quiet fading of a dream. For millions of people, she belonged to a golden version of television that now seems almost impossible to recreate. Back then, stars like Linda Evans were not just performers. They felt untouchable. They carried themselves with elegance, mystery, and a kind of emotional distance that made them seem almost immortal. Viewers did not simply watch them. They admired them. They built memories around them. And then one day, they realized those stars had grown older too. That realization is never easy, because when people look at Linda Evans now, they are not only seeing an actress in her 80s, they are seeing the distance between then and now. They are seeing how much the world has changed. They are seeing how quickly time can turn glamour into memory. And perhaps most painfully of all, they are seeing how even the most admired women in Hollywood could not escape loneliness, disappointment, or the silent ache that comes with age. That is what gives Linda Evans's story its emotional weight. She had the fame, she had the beauty, she had the admiration, she had the role that made her unforgettable. But like so many people, she still had to face the quiet moments no audience ever sees. The moments after heartbreak. The moments after the phone stops ringing as often. The moments after a career peak has passed and the world begins looking somewhere else. The moments when a person sits alone with memories that no one else can fully feel. That is where the real story begins. It is easy to celebrate someone when they are at the top. It is easy to praise glamour when the lights are bright. But there is something much more moving about the years that come after. Those are the years when a person can no longer rely on applause to define them. Those are the years when identity becomes personal again. And for a woman like Linda Evans, whose image was once so widely adored, that transition must have been profound. Imagine spending years being told you are extraordinary. Then imagine waking up one day and realizing the world has moved on. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you failed, but simply because time never asks permission. That is the part of fame people rarely talk about. The pain is not always in losing status. Sometimes the pain is in becoming invisible after being seen so intensely for so long. And yet Linda Evans never seemed bitter in the way some might expect. That is part of what makes her story so graceful. She did not rage against the passing of time in public. She did not turn her later years into a desperate performance of trying to be who she once was. Instead, she seemed to accept life as it came, even when that meant letting go of the image that once defined her. There is something deeply moving in that kind of surrender. Not surrender to sadness, surrender to truth. The truth that youth does not stay. The truth that beauty evolves. The truth that even legends must one day live ordinary mornings, quiet afternoons, and reflective evenings far from the noise that once surrounded them. For fans, that truth can be devastating. Because people do not want stars like Linda Evans to become ordinary. They want them frozen in time. They want Crystal Carrington forever glowing under chandeliers, forever composed, forever radiant, forever untouched by age or sorrow. But the real Linda Evans had to keep living after the credits rolled. She had to wake up each day not as a fantasy, but as herself. And perhaps that is the bravest thing she ever did. To live without the shield of the character. To live without the certainty of constant attention. To live with memories that must sometimes feel both beautiful and painful at once. By 83, a person carries so much that cannot be seen from the outside. Faces change, voices soften, and public appearances become rarer. But within that quieter life are entire worlds of remembrance. Love once felt deeply. Loss once endured silently. Triumphs now far away. Names, places, sets, and scenes that still live in the heart long after the cameras stop recording. It is impossible not to wonder what Linda Evans remembers when she looks back. Does she think of the thrill of early success? Does she think of the love she hoped would last? Does she think of the years when she could walk onto a set and know millions would soon be watching? Or does she think of the quieter victories, surviving pain, protecting her peace, and learning how to exist outside the machinery of fame? Maybe all of it lives together. Maybe that is why her story feels so emotional. It is not a simple tragedy, and it is not a fairy tale. It is something far more honest. It is the story of a woman who had extraordinary visibility, but still had to endure the same things that break ordinary hearts. Betrayal, disappointment, aging, distance, and the soft grief of watching life transform. And still, somehow, grace remained. That may be Linda Evans's true legacy. Not just that she was beautiful, not just that she was famous, not just that she starred in one of television's most iconic dramas, but that she carried herself with softness through a world that could be cruel. At 83, that softness means more than ever. Because in the end, the world does not cry for Linda Evans simply because she grew older. It cries because she reminds us that everyone grows older. Even the women we thought were made of light. Even the stars who once seemed beyond reach. Even the faces that once defined an entire era. And when those stars become human in front of us, the illusion breaks. But sometimes, what remains after the illusion is even more beautiful. There comes a moment in every great star's story when the spotlight no longer tells the whole truth. And in Linda Evans's case, that moment may be the most emotional part of all. Because once the beauty, the fame, and the legend are stripped down to something quieter, what remains is not just an actress from another era. What remains is a human life, one filled with longing, endurance, memories, and the kind of silent strength that rarely makes headlines. That is why Linda Evans still moves people. Not because she was perfect, but because she was never just the glamorous image the world projected onto her. Behind the glowing smile and the polished elegance was a woman who knew disappointment. A woman who knew what it meant to love and lose. A woman who knew that being admired by millions could never protect a heart from breaking in private. And perhaps that is what makes her story so unforgettable now. At 83, the fantasy has faded, but the humanity has become impossible to ignore. For fans who grew up watching her, that realization can feel almost overwhelming. Because Linda Evans does not simply remind them of television history, she reminds them of time itself. She reminds them of evenings that are gone, of family members they used to watch TV with, of living rooms filled with laughter, routine, and the comfort of familiar faces on a screen. She reminds them of a world that felt slower, softer, and somehow more magical. And when they see her now, older and far removed from the peak of that fame, the emotion is not only about her aging, it is about their own. That is what makes stories like hers so powerful. The audience is not just mourning the passing of a star's youth. They are mourning the passing of their own years, their own memories, and their own lost chapters. Linda Evans becomes more than a person in that moment. She becomes a symbol of everything that once felt permanent and turned out not to be. And that truth hurts. Because no matter how bright someone once shined, life eventually becomes quieter. The red carpets end. The interviews slow down. The phones ring less often. The headlines stop arriving. And a person who was once recognized everywhere must learn how to live with a different kind of identity. One that no longer depends on public attention. That transition can be brutal. Especially for someone who spent so many years being celebrated for beauty and grace. Hollywood has never been kind to women growing older. It celebrates them at their peak, then often turns away the moment time begins to show. That harshness has wounded countless stars, and whether they speak about it openly or not, the effect is real. Linda Evans lived through that system. She lived through the years when image was everything, and aging was treated almost like a betrayal. And yet, even now, there is something deeply dignified about the way her story has unfolded. She did not destroy herself trying to remain 20 forever. She did not chase attention at any cost. She did not turn her later life into a spectacle of desperation. Instead, she seemed to let life become quieter. And maybe that is what makes her so moving now. There is sorrow in quietness, yes, but there is also wisdom. A kind of grace that can only come after someone has lived through enough illusions to stop needing them. Linda Evans, once surrounded by the artificial brightness of television glamour, seems in her later years to represent something much deeper than glamour ever could. She represents peace after noise, distance after exposure, reality after illusion. And that kind of transformation is not small. It is enormous. Because many people spend their entire lives chasing significance, while Linda Evans had to learn how to live after already having it. She had already been adored, already been envied, already been made into an icon. The challenge was never becoming famous. The challenge was learning who she was once fame no longer stood in the middle of every room. That is a hard journey for anyone. But it may be especially hard for someone whose image was once so powerfully tied to elegance, romance, and idealized femininity. When the world sees you as timeless, it leaves very little room for you to become simply human. And yet, that is exactly what happened. Linda Evans became human in the eyes of the public, visibly, inevitably, and honestly. That can feel heartbreaking to those who loved her from afar. But maybe it should also feel inspiring. Because growing older in a world obsessed with youth takes courage. Living privately after public adoration takes courage. Accepting change without losing your dignity takes courage. And Linda Evans seems to embody that courage in a way that is soft rather than loud. She does not need to shout her legacy. She does not need to defend what she once was. She does not need to prove that she mattered. The tears people feel when they think about her are not tears of pity. They are tears of recognition. Recognition that behind every glamorous face is a real life. Recognition that even the most admired women carry invisible scars. Recognition that beauty may fade, but grace can deepen. That may be why Linda Evans still lingers so powerfully in the hearts of fans. Not because she stayed frozen in her prime, but because she didn't. She kept living. She kept changing. She kept carrying the weight of years with the same softness that once made audiences love her in the first place. And in the end, that may be more moving than any role she ever played. Because roles end, scenes fade, shows become reruns. But the emotional truth of a life, a real life, stays with people. Linda Evans gave audiences glamour once. Now, without even trying, she gives them something even rarer: perspective. She reminds the world that behind every legend is a person who eventually has to sit with memory, loss, silence, and the passage of time. She reminds us that aging is not the destruction of beauty, but the revelation of what beauty could not hide forever. She reminds us that the most touching part of a star's story may come long after the applause has ended. And that is why, at 83, Linda Evans can still break hearts. Not because she is gone, not because she has been forgotten, but because she remains. Softer, older, quieter, and more real than ever. And sometimes, that is the saddest and most beautiful thing of all. By the time a star reaches 83, the story is no longer just about fame. It becomes a story about what remains. And in Linda Evans's case, what remains is something far more powerful than the glamour that first made the world fall in love with her. What remains is the quiet force of a life that endured, a life that changed, a life that kept moving long after the spotlight faded and the fantasy began to dissolve. That is the part many people are not prepared for. They remember the shimmering image. They remember the beauty. They remember the perfect hair, the soft voice, the grace under pressure, the elegance that made her seem almost unreal. But when they look at Linda Evans now, they are confronted by something much deeper than nostalgia. They are confronted by truth. The truth that even the most admired faces eventually carry the marks of time. The truth that fame cannot shield anyone from loneliness. The truth that beauty may open doors, but it cannot stop life from hurting. And the truth that growing older is not something even legends can escape. This is why Linda Evans's story affects people in such a personal way. Because beneath the television legacy, beneath the iconic roles, beneath the years of public admiration, there is something universal in her journey. She lived through the kind of emotional changes that millions understand, but rarely see reflected in the lives of stars. Love that didn't last. Dreams that changed shape. A career that soared, then softened. A public image that remained frozen in memory while the real woman behind it kept going, day by day, year by year. That contrast is heartbreaking. The world often wants celebrities to stay exactly as they were at the peak of their fame. It wants them preserved like photographs, beautiful, still, and untouched. But Linda Evans was never a photograph. She was a person. And people evolve, suffer, heal, retreat, remember, and age. There is a sorrow in that, but there is also great beauty. Because what is more meaningful in the end? To remain an illusion forever? Or to become something real enough that people can truly feel your humanity? Linda Evans became real in a way that only time can make possible. At the height of her stardom, people saw perfection. Now they see vulnerability. At the height of her fame, people saw control. Now they see softness. At the height of her success, people saw a woman surrounded by glamour. Now they see someone who has outlived that world and carries its memories alone. That image can be hard to take, not because it is ugly, but because it is honest. And honesty has a way of reaching deeper than glamour ever could. When people feel emotional seeing Linda Evans at 83, they are not simply reacting to how she looks. They are reacting to everything her life now represents. They are thinking about how quickly eras disappear, how suddenly fame becomes history, how even the brightest names from television's golden decades can become quiet figures living far from the noise that once defined them. And maybe, deep down, that is what hurts the most. The silence. Not the dramatic kind, the ordinary kind. The kind that comes when a person who was once surrounded by schedules, sets, interviews, and admiration begins living in a world where mornings are slower and the past feels closer than the future. For some, that sounds sad. But maybe it is also sacred. Because in that silence, a person finally hears themselves. Perhaps Linda Evans's later years are not a tragedy at all. Perhaps they are the part of the story where the performance ends and the soul gets to breathe. Perhaps after all the pressure to be stunning, composed, and admired, there is relief in no longer needing to be anything for anyone except yourself. That is not loss. That is freedom. Still, freedom can be lonely. And that is where the emotion in her story deepens. Fans sense the loneliness, whether spoken or unspoken. They sense the distance between the woman they remember and the life she lives now. They sense the weight of years, the quiet after noise, the ache that naturally comes when someone has lived long enough to watch entire chapters of their world disappear. People she worked with are gone. Moments that once felt immediate are now history. The industry she knew has changed beyond recognition. And the version of Linda Evans that millions remember exists now mostly in reruns, photographs, and memory. Imagine carrying that. Imagine being able to look back on a life so many envied and still knowing that no amount of applause could stop time from taking what it always takes. That realization gives her story its final emotional power. Because Linda Evans is not just a woman who got older. She is a woman who survived the distance between who the world saw and who she really was. She survived the collapse of illusion. She survived heartbreak. She survived reinvention. She survived being remembered for a version of herself that no longer exists. And somehow, through all of that, she kept her grace. That may be the most moving detail of all. Not that she stayed glamorous, but that she stayed gentle. Not that she stayed famous, but that she stayed dignified. Not that she escaped pain, but that pain did not seem to harden her into something bitter. There is tremendous beauty in that kind of survival. It is the kind of beauty youth cannot imitate, the kind of beauty cameras cannot manufacture, the kind of beauty that only appears after a life has been lived fully enough to leave behind both light and shadow. At 83, Linda Evans stands as more than a former television icon. She stands as proof that there is something beyond the applause, something beyond the perfect image, something beyond the fantasy the public once adored. A real woman, a real life, a real story. And sometimes that is the hardest thing for fans to accept, and the very reason they cannot stop thinking about her. Because once the glamour fades, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is the person. And in Linda Evans's case, that person still carries enough grace to move hearts decades after the world first fell in love with her. In the end, the saddest stories are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the quiet ones, the ones that do not end in scandal, the ones that do not explode in public, the ones that simply fade, little by little, into memory. And maybe that is why Linda Evans's story hits so deeply. Because hers is not just the story of a star who grew older. It is the story of a woman who once seemed untouchable, only to remind the world that no one truly is. There was a time when Linda Evans stood at the center of glamour. She represented elegance, beauty, and a kind of softness that felt rare even then. To millions, she was more than a television actress. She was an image of grace people thought time could never reach. But time reaches everyone. No matter how admired, how photographed, how unforgettable someone once was, the years keep moving. And that is where the heartbreak begins. Not in failure, not in disgrace, but in the simple truth that even legends become fragile in the eyes of those who once idolized them. When people look at Linda Evans now, they are not just seeing age. They are seeing everything that age carries with it. The vanished years, the lost moments, the people who are no longer here. The version of life that once felt so vivid and is now impossible to return to. She reminds them of an era that lives on only in reruns, old interviews, and the private corners of memory. That is why the emotion feels so heavy. Because Linda Evans is not just Linda Evans anymore in the minds of many viewers. She is the sound of the past, the feeling of a different world, the face of a chapter people did not realize they would one day grieve. And grief is strange like that. Sometimes you do not grieve because something is gone completely. Sometimes you grieve because a trace of it still remains. A familiar face, now older. A gentle voice, now softer. A name from another time, still recognized, still loved, but wrapped in the silence of passing years. That kind of grief is hard to explain, but almost everyone feels it eventually. It is the pain of seeing proof that life kept moving. And Linda Evans, at 83, has become that proof for so many. She is proof that beauty changes, proof that fame is temporary, proof that youth is not a place anyone can stay, proof that a woman once surrounded by attention can one day become a quiet keeper of memories. But she is also proof of something else. That grace can survive. That even after heartbreak, distance, and time, something beautiful can remain. Not the manufactured beauty of perfect lighting and television illusion, but the deeper beauty of endurance. The beauty of someone who has lived through enough to become softer instead of harder. The beauty of someone who no longer needs the world's approval to matter. That may be Linda Evans's greatest legacy. Not just that she was glamorous, Not just that she was famous. Not just that she helped define an era of television. But that she showed what it looks like when the glamour disappears and dignity stays. That is rare. Very rare. Because many people know how to shine when the world is watching. Far fewer know how to carry themselves when the world has grown quiet. Linda Evans seems to belong to that second kind. And that is why her story does not feel empty. It feels tender. It feels human. It feels like the kind of story that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Not because it is dramatic in the usual sense, but because it touches something personal in everyone who sees it. We all lose versions of ourselves. We all leave behind younger faces, older dreams, vanished seasons. We all become memories to someone, even while still living. Linda Evans just happens to do it in front of a world that once watched her shine. And maybe that is what makes it so emotional. She lived long enough to become more than an icon. She became a reminder. A reminder that time is undefeated. A reminder that the spotlight never tells the whole story. A reminder that behind every legend is a person who must one day sit quietly with their own memories. At 83, Linda Evans does not need pity. What she inspires is something far more powerful than pity. She inspires reflection. She makes people stop and think about how quickly the years pass, about how beauty never really disappears but changes form, about how the people who once seemed larger than life are often carrying the same human ache as everyone else, about how the real ending of a star's story is not found in ratings, awards, or magazine covers. It is found in what remains when all of that is gone. And with Linda Evans, what remains is grace. Grace in survival. Grace in silence. Grace in aging. Grace in being remembered not only for how radiant she once looked, but for how deeply she still makes people feel. That is why her story lingers. That is why people cannot simply scroll past and forget her. That is why her name still stirs something sad and beautiful at the same time. Because Linda Evans is no longer just a star from the past. She is a living echo of an era. A woman who outlasted the fantasy. A face that once symbolized perfection and now symbolizes something far more moving. Truth. And truth, when it arrives this gently, can break your heart. So what happened to Linda Evans at 83? Life happened. Time happened. Love happened. Loss happened. Memory happened. And through it all, somehow, she remained Linda Evans. Older, quieter, and far more human than the world ever allowed her to be when she was young. Maybe that is not a tragedy after all. Maybe that is the final, beautiful lesson of her story. That even when the spotlight fades, even when beauty changes, even when the world moves on, a life lived with grace can still leave people speechless. And Linda Evans did exactly that.